Hello, neighborhood law professor Leah Litman, also co-host of Strict Scrutiny, here to explain the latest lawless, hackish bullshit the Supreme Court has pulled. So on Monday, before the week had really even gotten started, the Supreme Court released a wild order on the shadow docket that A, allowed Donald Trump to violate the law and consolidate more power over the executive branch, and B, all but declared that the Supreme Court was going to overrule yet another case to allow him to do so. And indeed, that the court would pretend like that case was already overruled even before they did the damn thing. Okay, this particular case concerns the Federal Trade Commission. That is a multi-member body of experts in the federal government that makes decisions about unfair trade practices, among other things. By law, Congress has made the FTC an independent expert body because Congress has prohibited the president from firing the commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission except for what's called for cause. Basically, the commissioners have to do some pretty bad stuff, like violating the law or not showing up for work, in order for the president to fire them. The law does not allow the president to fire an FTC commissioner just because he wants to, or just because he wants to put in one of his own toadies who will do his bidding. Someone like, I don't know, Brendan Carr, who threatened broadcast licenses of places that didn't take Jimmy Kimmel off the air. Just hypothetically, but I digress. So there is a near centuries-old Supreme Court case, Humphrey's Executor, that said it is perfectly constitutional for Congress to create expert agencies that are insulated from presidential removal. That is, it's perfectly constitutional for Congress to prohibit the president from removing the heads of these agencies, except for cause. That case, Humphrey's Executor, established the basis for independent agencies that make up the modern administrative state in the federal government, like the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, or the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, you name it. But here's the thing. The right-wing wingnuts aren't a fan of independent agencies. Project 2025 even called on the next Republican administration to ask the Supreme Court to overrule Humphrey's Executor, the case that had established the basis for these independent agencies. Spoiler alert. Trump administration has done that as well. They have asked the Supreme Court to overrule Humphrey's Executor. More on that soon. But the right-wing legal movement has, for the last few decades, been pushing this theory called the Unitary executive theory that maintains the president has to have the power to fire anyone and everyone in the executive branch who's exercising significant power. Yes, while Donald Trump was saying, "You're fired" on TV, the Republican legal movement, including people like Chief Justice John Roberts, when he was a lawyer in the Reagan administration, they were saying and arguing that presidents have to have the power to fire people. Huge Apprentice fans, these guys, apparently. The Unitary executive theory represents a really expansive theory of presidential power. It makes the president more like a king because it gives the president substantial power and sway over the executive branch. It allows him to remove independent experts and replace them with lackeys who will do his bidding. It allows him to violate laws, the statutes that prohibit him from firing people. It is a recipe for making the president into a monarch above the law. I mean, think about it for a second. If the president can just fire people willy-nilly and replace them with whoever he wants, since this Senate will give him whoever he wants, that's how you get a Secretary of Health and Human Services who's supposed to be guiding medical and healthcare in the country, saying Tylenol causes autism, maybe, despite all contrary evidence. That's how you get a Secretary of Health and Human Services saying kids shouldn't have vaccines. That's how you get an FCC commissioner who is threatening the free speech rights of anyone or anything that deigns to mock the president or his political allies. That's what the Unitary executive theory would wreak. So over the last few months, the Supreme Court has been unitary executive curious, at least, and has allowed the president to fire the heads of several multi-member commissions, including the National Labor Relations Board and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, in violation of federal law. But, and here's the but, the Supreme Court never said anything about Humphrey's executor, that centuries-old decision that said Congress can create these expert agencies whose heads can't be fired by the president at will. The Supreme Court paused lower court rulings that had prohibited the president from firing people and said, well, presidents generally get to fire people who exercise significant executive power without explaining what Humphrey's executor now stood for. Well, now the president went ahead and tried to fire people at the very same agency that Humphrey's executor said Congress could prohibit presidents from firing people willy-nilly. Yes, Humphrey's executor was about the Federal Trade Commission. It upheld the law that said presidents can't just fire federal trade commissioners. Now, the Supreme Court allowed Donald Trump to go ahead and fire the FTC commissioner on what's called the shadow docket. These are the set of orders and decisions the Supreme Court issues without briefing or oral argument, or sometimes without explanation. Just they did not explain why they were allowing Trump to fire the head of an agency in violation of a federal law that the Supreme Court had previously upheld. The court did put this case involving the FTC on their docket to be argued, but not until December. In December, the Supreme Court will hear arguments about whether to overrule Humphrey's executor, the case upholding the law that had prohibited the president from firing FTC commissioners at will. But apparently, the Republican appointees were so hot to trot, they went ahead and said, well, even before we do the damn thing and overrule Humphrey's executor, you, Donald Trump, can go ahead and violate this statute that the Supreme Court has said is constitutional and act like we have already overruled that decision. But the Supreme Court's order in this FTC case is actually even more wild than that. So the Supreme Court granted what's called certiorari before judgment. Certiorari just means they decided to hear the case, and before judgment means they decided to hear this case ASAP, before a federal court of appeals has even heard the case. As Justice Kagan said in her dissent for the 3 Democratic appointees, the court was apparently, quote, raring to go. Indeed, this court has been in a huge hurry to impose its agenda on the country. For 15 years, between August of 2024 and February 2019, there were 0 cases of certiorari before judgment. This case involving the FTC is now the 23rd since then. These guys, again, can't wait to impose their views on the entire country. It is also very revealing that the Supreme Court chooses to hurry up when it wants to. And when it hurries up is quite revealing. It hurries up to benefit Donald Trump. Remember that immunity case where Donald Trump was arguing he was immune from criminal prosecution for his role in January 6th and Stop the Steal? The special counsel, the prosecutor in that case, had asked the Supreme Court to take the immunity case before the Court of Appeals, that is, to grant certiorari before judgment in December, to ensure that there would be a speedy resolution of the immunity appeal and a trial could happen on these election interference charges before the November 2024 election. The Supreme Court declined to do so there. And then they delayed scheduling argument in the immunity case for months after they eventually decided to hear it, slow-walking the immunity appeal, which ensured there would be no trial on federal election interference charges before the election. So, Supreme Court hurries up when they want to overrule a case and let Trump act in violation of the law, but they slow down when people try to hold Trump accountable for violating the law. I still want to come back to the fact that Humphrey's executor, that Supreme Court case, is still the law, that the Supreme Court has not yet overruled that case. And that case says it is constitutional for Congress to protect federal trade commissioners from removal. So Congress has a law that says presidents can't just fire FTC commissioners, and the Supreme Court has said that law is constitutional. This lawless Supreme Court hasn't yet ruled that statute restricting the president's power to fire FTC commissioners unconstitutional, but they are so fucking eager to do so. They just can't wait to impose their views on the country and give Donald Trump the power that they have said, the law now is apparently what the court will do, not what the court has done or what the court's current cases say. As Justice Kagan wrote, in her dissent, again for the 3 Democratic appointees, quote, "Our emergency docket should not be used, as it has been, to transfer government authority from Congress to the president and thus to reshape the nation's separation of powers," end quote. Oh, and one other thing. These guys who are allowing Donald Trump to violate federal law, saying he has the power to act in violation of Congress's duly enacted laws, these are the same guys that said Joe Biden, a Democratic president, did not have the authority to exercise the authority that Congress had actually given to him to cancel student debt relief. So apparently the laws, Republican presidents have all the power and get to do whatever they want, even where Congress has prohibited it. But Democratic presidents have no power, even when Congress tried to give it to them. Like I said, lawless hacks. I lied when I said just one more thing. There's still one more thing. Okay. In this order, in the Federal Trade Commissioner case about whether Trump can fire the FTC commissioner, the Supreme Court added another question to the case. That is, it's not just about whether the Supreme Court will overrule Humphrey's executor. What's the other question they said they wanted to weigh in on? Whether a federal court may prevent a person's removal from public office. What does that mean? It could mean that even if the president fires someone in violation of federal law, and even if the Supreme Court says that federal law is constitutional, i.e. that Congress can prohibit the president from firing someone, federal courts might not be able to do anything about it. Federal courts might not be able to restore that person to office. This could mean that hypothetically, if the president fires, members of the Federal Reserve Board in violation of laws that are constitutional, the Supreme Court would say, too bad, presidents can do that, and nothing you can do about it. Federal courts. If you want to hear more about what the Supreme Court is up to, be sure to check out Strict Scrutiny. New episodes drop every Monday.